Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Kevin, for organising this. Give me a chance to speak about one of my hobby horses, which we'll see as we go along, is that we do have to introduce, I think, a Clean Air Act in Ireland. If you want some more of the background information about what I'm saying, then please go to our crack.ucc.ie website, where there's a number of things. There's blogs and there's videos and things for you to look at. So let's begin. I think to begin, I'm going to say, what is air pollution? And I'm going to have a few brief words about what air pollution is. How do we monitor it is another important question that we need to answer. And how is that done abroad in the EU, around the world even? So we're going to talk about that early on, and then, of course, I'm going to move in to what I think is my main message for today, is what can we do about air quality monitoring in the future? So, what are the important air pollutants, ones that you might know? Why do we do it? There are two main reasons why we monitor air pollutants, chemicals in the air. One is to do with, perhaps the reason that most of you are here tonight, is to do with health and wellness, and the other one is to do with climate change. And I'm not going to say very much more about that during this talk. But even those of you who hated chemistry at school, there's a few chemicals here that may give you flashbacks, but nitrogen dioxide, something that's been big in the news over the past few weeks with the VW experience, but ammonia and ozone, acid rain, and hydrocarbons. But the majority of the things that John and I will be speaking about tonight are these things that you know as soot. But I'm going to be calling them, we'll both be calling them particulate matter, because we'll be looking at very small parts of soot that is called PM for short. That's just shorthand notation. And, I'd hope with the climate change that carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide and methane are things that you all know well. So, what are the main sources of air pollution? One that often surprises people is how important agriculture is in producing pollution, particularly ammonia and methane. We'll see a bit later on is that we're only beginning to realise now is how important releasing ammonia is and how bad that is, because it can go on to make particles themselves. But diesel bad, obviously Volkswagen fiddling their NOx emissions is something that is not good. And the majority of this talk will be on solid fuels, as will John's. So we have smoky coal, less smoke coal, peat and wood. And you may get a few surprises about wood, about the things that we say in a minute. What's the problem with these particles? Why am I keep going on about particles? Well, what the particles are, and here's a couple of examples, and our jargon is to call them PM10 and PM2.5, and here's a human hair, and the PM10 are about a fifth of the width of a human hair, and PM2.5 are about a 20th or so of a human hair, and they can enter our system. The larger ones can get lodged in this area, and we think probably a bit more to do with allergies and exacerbation of respiratory problems. But there are these, the smaller ones, the PM2.5 and smaller, that can get well into the lungs here. And these are the ones that are becoming to be thought of as the most damaging. They can cause death. I know we're here for a somewhat different purpose tonight to do with asthma, although that too can lead in at-risk populations to real problems. And the reason we began to think that PM2.5 was such a killer was a very large study that was done in the 1990s in Harvard and going around many counties over the whole of the United States. And what they found is when you've got a relatively low amount of this PM2.5, then the age expectancy was a bit over, say, let's say 80. When you got quite a lot of PM 2.5, so you get more and more, the age expectancy was going down. I mean, at the most it's 10 years, but on the whole, if you're getting enough exposure to this PM2.5, it's about 6 years that was being taken off life. This dotted line is really where we set limits currently. These are not the World Health Organization limits, but they're the sort of limits that are set currently for legislation. So that's why we are interested in PM 2.5. A little bit more lesson work here about air pollution and particles is that it is important to realise that there are effectively two families of particles. The first we call primary and the second we call secondary. And the one that you know most about, I think, is probably primary. When you burn solid fuels, you get particles coming off, and there's the number there, but 4.3 kilogram per 1,000 kilograms burnt for smoky coal. We're just going to direct you to the blue ones, though, and gas, of course, excellent, 0. There's none. But look at wood. Wood, 9, twice as much as smoky coal that is produced, these primary particles. But let's look at secondary particles. What secondary particles are is that these are caused by vapors and gases that are produced by the burning process of the fuel, and those vapors and gases can react together. And certainly there can be reactions between acidity that comes off of some of these fuels, nitric acid and sulfuric acid, and, let's go back to it, ammonia that is released by the farming and agriculture. And what they can do is to make small solids, and the solids come from the nitric acid content and the sulfuric acid content. But here it's somewhat different, because here wood is the good guy and coal is the bad guy. So it's a complex problem, and we'll see that always with atmospheric chemistry. It's always a complicated problem, but it's not quite as simple as some people say, in simply we can sort this problem out of solid fuel simply by banning smoky coal. It's a good first step, but beyond that, there are other problems. Really, probably the answer is, other than going over to solar energy in the end, is gas, natural gas. A lot more about what we've been doing in the next talk by John, but along the lines of trying to make those measurements of the solid particulate matter is something called the Sapphire Project, and the measurements made in some small towns, and for reasons that will become clear when John speaks, that we've been doing over the last 2 years. So I'll leave that and leave him to look at it, and then just say, well, how do these air pollutants and their measurements get turned into the thing that we called air quality? And air quality really is almost a definition, I suppose, of what EU directives tell us, that there are certain legislative limits that there should be, of which you should not go over, and you should keep under in order to keep a healthy public. And that's all sort of summarised in something called a CAFE directive. And what it says is that, of course, that local authorities and countries should make measurements, and that they should release as up-to-date information to the public and to the legislators. And to ease how to do that, countries are asked to divide themselves into zones for air quality monitoring, and Ireland, and the EPA is our body that does that, divides us into 4. Those 4 zones are A, B, C, D, and Dublin is A, B is Cork. Then we have a very large set of things called small towns or cities greater than 15,000 population. And then perhaps the biggest, this is the grey area, is rural. So we have a very large quantity of possibilities in Ireland, but the one, of course, that the most concentration on is Dublin. September, I looked to see is how well was Ireland doing regarding this up-to-date information output to the public compared to other countries. What you see is this vast number of flags. All of these flags really represent real-time monitoring stations throughout the whole of Europe. Indeed, there's even one in Iran there. These real-time monitoring stations. The different colours mean red is not good pollution, green is good, and oh dear, Ireland has got none. 23rd of September. So there is a problem there. I think anyone would say straight away that the big gap in that map is Ireland not doing any or insufficient real-time monitoring. There's another website as well that's pretty much Europe, and it's an A to Z of countries. Starts with Andorra and it ends with if there is a country that's got Z in it, that's where it ends. But if we go down the A's, the B's, the C's, and get to the G's, Greece, not well spelt, but nonetheless that's the website, it then jumps to Italy, and of course, again, Ireland isn't there. Virtually every other country in the EU is there, Ireland isn't. The websites for both those things are in the presentation. So what do we actually do in Ireland? What is done by the EPA, by local authorities? Here's the number of stations that there are. The yellow ones, unfortunately, or the inactive ones, the ones that are no longer current, and the mauve ones are those that are current. There's a bit of a concentration, as I said before, in Dublin. And of all of those stations, how many of them really do the monitoring of those ninja killers, the PM2.5 and the PM10, in real time, anywhere, both of them, both sets of things? And we see that there are three. There's one in Ennis, one in Claremorris. So if you remember those old zones that I said, Zone C and Zone D, and of course in Dublin there's Zone A. None in Zone B, which is Cork. Now, that is a problem, it seems to me, is because if you remember that EU CAFE directive says that each of the zones has to be monitored and in real time, and it's not here in Cork. I'm not sure if there is anybody here from Cork County Council or whatever that can try to help explain that to me, but it is just something, I think, food for thought for you to take away. What do you use? What do you do with that information that you gain from this air quality monitoring? Well, a great innovation in the last 2 or 3 years has been by the HSC and the EPA in producing something called an air quality index for health. And many of you can see these very often. I think if you do use social media, that very often on Twitter, that there'll be a good, fair medium that come out. And they're done by the measurement, the real-time measurement of things like nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and our beloved particles as well. And that they take what is the best, the worst number of pollutant for whichever of the pollutants that it is, and they report that as an index, and that index then is translated into good, fair, very poor, poor, and again in Cork, it does seem to me very often when you look at the Twitter and it says air quality Cork good. How do they know? Because again on my 3rd of September, there was no monitoring of PM2.5 and PM10 being done. There was a great real world experiment that was carried out in Ireland on Halloween night because of the firework displays. Again, great. I mean, use it. You should use social media to send your message out. And the air quality indices were given here for that 31st of October, and you can see, I'm looking at just the particulate matter here, you can see it's going up and down, up and down, up and down, until we get to the 31st, and then whoomph, it goes up, it goes up. This is in Rathmines, Dublin, and it's the only data that there is in real time for the whole of the country. If we look at the other sites that the EPA showed that day, you'll see that there was something done at Bray and Ennis, Longford. There's a couple at this Rathmines site. And in Cork, of course, there are no real-time sites, but nonetheless, it was reported as good air quality. Not sure how they can do that. In Dublin, they reported it, I mean, as you could see from that graph where it was going up really, as very poor. But that was just one place in Dublin, it was just in Rathmines. What about the rest of Dublin? It's a bit bigger than that. And I'll show you what I mean by that, is that the same night in London, the air pollution was being measured in real time. And then we have this huge number of stations here, and you can see that in some places it is bad, yes, but in other places it's good. So if you don't have any or insufficient monitoring, how can you really give good advice to the public? How can you give up-to-date information as you're supposed to do by the CAFE directive? And other places do all this, all these measurements, because they've got these robust systems that sit around that are quite compact, not incredibly expensive, but expensive nonetheless. And this one is in Marylebone Road in London. And if there's going to be a more insecure place to get your bits of equipment beaten up, it would be Marylebone Road. But it's used, it's kept, and it reports. It reports. We just don't do that, even in Dublin. What's the problem? My opinions now coming out. So if you haven't thought there were opinions before, there are opinions coming out now. And my main thesis would be that Ireland's Air Pollution Act in 1987 is not fit for purpose. And there's a good reason for that. It was written at a time where simply we wanted to make sure that we were fitting in with legislative limits. Not much more than that. But worse, I think, is that what was set up then was that the air monitoring system was one which was done a bit ad hoc almost between these local county councils and the EPA. So it don't always have the same, in science you would have identical sets of reliable equipment all over Ireland. You wouldn't have this ad hoc set of things. So although the EPA does coordinate all of this, it does seem to me to be not quite the right basis on which to get good information, actually good data, to turn into good information and then to communicate to the public. So what do we need? Again, my view. What we need is a Clean Air Act. And the reason for that is because then front and centre would be the message about improving health. That's the aim. It's not the aim of this to just make sure we hit with the correct legislative limits as given by the EU or by the government. And for that, of course, you need that data to start with. And for that, you need a nationally operated air monitoring programme. You've got to have these identical procedures and equipment. It needs to be set up and coordinated. And you're going to need for that a very much expanded EPA to do it. Then, if you get that real-time information and lots of it, you can then actually contribute to those maps and those tables that I said earlier in Europe. You're only doing then what you're supposed to be doing from the terms of the CAFE directive. So that would happen as a natural consequence. I'd go further, though, if I was drafting this legislation. I would say that you can't burn solid fuel, because this is a real problem with particulate matter, as I showed you earlier, if you are sitting in part of the national gas grid that there is. And if you're not, then there has to be ways, economically speaking, of making sure that you are, because you should not burn solid fuel in the way that we're burning it pretty much these days. And as well, this is not a great message in Ireland, I realise, but you've got to do a lot about controlling agricultural emissions, particularly ammonia. And then obviously you should always be guided by what's happening in Europe in order to help your legislation be comprehensive. And you also need a comprehensive education program. It is all to do with education, education, education. It's a program that should be run by the Department of Environment, Education, EPA, interested stakeholders, even like us who are here tonight, including universities like the Crack Lab. We need to educate the public so that they know that the reason why maybe they've got to spend a bit more money on certain fuels is because of the costs that there will be eventually to the health service if you don't do something about it. And again, for that, you need something that looks a bit Big Brother, called a syndromic surveillance system, which is being set up more and more in the UK, in which you have real contact between the air pollution events as measured by the EPA and GPs and admissions, if you like, to A&E departments. So even simply saying, I've reported a number of asthma cases, and here we have this rather nasty set of particulate matter that's come around, in order to act after a time as an early warning system. And for that as well, you need to have the Me'erum being involved. So you need a lot more coordination of what's going on for the air pollution world between medics and scientists, physicists and meteorologists. And that means money, of course, because you're going to substantially increase the activities of all of these three bodies that I've said, in order really, and my aim here, will be to develop an early warning system for the at-risk population, people like some of you that are here tonight. If you know about the ozone hole, if you know about the VW emissions scandal, and as you'll hear soon enough about the Sapphire program, you'll realise that all of those issues were put to the fore by research. It wasn't just trying to do monitoring because it's the thing to do because of legislation. It was research. And what the EPA should do is to put much more a research part into its program. Britain has an environmental agency that that does its legislative part with, and it has a National Environmental Research Council. That's needed over here. Just finishing off now, a couple of bottom lines. 3.3 million premature annual deaths, 1.4 trillion costs. I put this 150 metres in because it's been shown, regarding asthma, that if you have schools that are more than 150 metres from a busy road, then you have less problems with asthma. And that there are just 3 real-time monitoring stations in Ireland, not really quite as many as there are in Tasmania even. In Tasmania, small island off a big continent, another small island off of a big continent here. We have this number, 27 of these monitoring stations, and this is November, at least one good thing, 2 stations have appeared in Dublin, one at Rathmines and one in Bray in the last 2 months. Still not as many as perhaps there ought to be, but as Lao Tzu, the ancient Chinese philosopher said, journey of 1,000 miles takes a first step. Thank you.